February 26, 1959. The Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia. A search party trudges through waist-deep snow, their breath-forming clouds in the frozen air. They've been searching for 9 missing hikers for 3 weeks. What they're about to discover is a horror that still haunts the world to this day. Walk with me as we unfold this dreadful story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. They find the tent first. It's half buried in snow on the slope of a mountain the local Mansi people call Kholat Shiachal, Dead Mountain. But something is immediately terrifyingly wrong. The tent has been slashed open from the inside. Inside, they find boots, warm clothing, food, everything the hikers would need to survive in negative 40-degree temperatures. But the hikers themselves, gone. Fled into the deadly Siberian night, wearing nothing but their underwear and thin layers. The search party follows a trail of footprints leading down the slope toward the tree line. Some prints are from bare feet, others from feet wearing only socks. The tracks suggest the hikers were walking calmly, not running, not panicking, just walking to their deaths. By the time all 9 bodies are recovered over the following months, the mystery only deepens. Massive internal injuries with no external trauma, missing eyes, a missing tongue, traces of radiation on their clothing, and not a single satisfactory explanation. This is the Dyatlov Pass Incident, and after 65 years, it remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in human history. The expedition. To understand what happened on that mountain, we need to understand who these 9 people were, because this wasn't a group of naive tourists wandering into danger. These were experienced hikers, athletes, the best of the best. The expedition was organized by the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg. It was meant to be a challenging winter trek across the northern Urals, covering over 190 miles. The route was classified as Category 3, the most difficult designation in Soviet mountaineering. But for this group, it was exactly the kind of challenge they craved. The leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a 5th-year student of radio engineering. Dyatlov was known for his meticulous planning and his obsession with outdoor adventure. He'd been hiking and skiing since he was a teenager, and he'd successfully led multiple difficult expeditions before this one. His friend, Zina Kolmogorova, was also 23, a talented student and experienced hiker. Those who knew her described her as strong-willed, intelligent, and fearless in the wilderness. Then there was Rustam Slobodin, 23, studying engineering. He was known for his humor, his guitar playing, and his ability to keep spirits high even in the harshest conditions. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both called Yuri or Georgi, were among the oldest in the group at 24 and 23 respectively. Doroshenko was studying economics. Krivonishenko was an engineer who had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility. Both were veteran hikers. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, was quiet and thoughtful, studying physics and meteorology. His technical knowledge made him invaluable on expeditions. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, came from a family of French communists who had immigrated to the Soviet Union. He was an engineering student and a skilled outdoorsman. Lyudmila Dubinina, 21, was one of the youngest but one of the most experienced. She'd been hiking since childhood and had completed numerous difficult routes. She kept a detailed diary of all her adventures. And finally, Alexander Zolotaryov, 37, the oldest member of the group. Zolotaryov was something of an enigma, a veteran of World War II. He'd fought at Stalingrad and Berlin. He'd earned multiple medals and had survived some of the worst combat the Eastern Front had to offer. After the war, he'd become an outdoor instructor. He was tough, experienced, and had more survival knowledge than the rest of the group combined. These weren't reckless kids. This was a group of intelligent, physically fit, highly experienced winter hikers. Several had aspirations of becoming masters of sport, a prestigious Soviet athletic classification. This expedition was part of their qualification. The plan was to start from Vizhai, a small settlement in the northern Urals, and trek northwest through the mountains, eventually reaching the village of Vijay on the other side. The round trip would take about 3 weeks. There was actually a 10th member initially. Yuri Udin, a 21-year-old economics student, started the journey with them. But on January 28th, just a few days in, Udin fell ill with severe back pain and sciatica. The decision was made that he would turn back. That decision saved his life. Udin said goodbye to his friends on January 28th. It was the last time any of them would be seen alive. In later interviews, Udin would describe the moment with devastating clarity. "I can still see them waving goodbye. They were laughing, joking. We thought we'd see each other in a couple of weeks. I was actually jealous I had to turn back." The remaining 9 continued on. For the next few days, everything proceeded normally. The group kept detailed diaries and took numerous photographs. The images show them smiling, joking around, building shelters, skiing through pristine, snow-covered forests. They encountered extreme cold and difficult terrain, but nothing they couldn't handle. These were conditions they had trained for. On January 31st, they reached the edge of the highland zone. They cached some food and equipment there, planning to pick it up on the return journey. This was standard practice. It would lighten their load for the most difficult part of the trek. February 1st, 1959. The last day. The weather was deteriorating. Heavy snowfall, high winds, visibility was poor. According to their route plan, they intended to cross the pass and set up camp on the other side of the mountain. But as the day wore on and conditions worsened, they made a decision. Whether it was a navigation error caused by the poor visibility or a deliberate choice to set up camp before crossing the pass, we'll never know. But instead of pushing through to the other side, they began setting up their tent on the slope of Koletsyakhl, Dead Mountain. The photos from that final day show them cutting into the snow to create a level platform for the tent. The wind is clearly fierce. You can see it in the way their clothing whips around them, but they don't look worried. They're experienced enough to know you sometimes have to camp in bad weather. They'd done it before. The last photograph was taken in the late afternoon. It shows them digging in the snow, preparing the tent site. The sky is gray and heavy with snow. After that, silence. The search. Igor Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram to the university sports club as soon as the group returned to civilization. The expected date was February 12th, but the 12th came and went. No telegram. At first, no one was particularly worried. Delays were common on winter expeditions. Bad weather could slow you down by days. Maybe they'd extended the route. Maybe they were just taking their time on the way back. But as the days stretched on, concern grew. The families started asking questions. By February 20th, 8 days overdue, it was clear something was wrong. A search party was organized, volunteers from the university, other students and instructors who knew the missing hikers, local Mansi hunters who knew the terrain, and military personnel, because this was the Soviet Union, and the military got involved in everything. The search area was vast, thousands of square miles of frozen wilderness. The search parties used helicopters, planes, skis, and dogs. They split into multiple groups, each covering different sections of the planned route. On February 25th, one of the search parties reached the abandoned food cache the hikers had left on January 31st. Good. That meant they were on the right track. The group had made it this far. The next day, February 26th, search party member Mikhail Sharavin was approaching Koletsyakhl when he spotted something unusual on the mountain slope, a dark shape partially covered in snow. The tent. When the search party reached it, they froze. Even these experienced searchers, who thought they were prepared for anything, weren't prepared for what they saw. The tent was still standing, but barely, heavily damaged by wind and weighted down by snow. But the damage wasn't from the weather. The tent had been cut, slashed, ripped open from the inside, long, deliberate cuts in the canvas. The kind of cuts you'd make if you were desperately trying to escape and couldn't get to the entrance. Inside, they found boots, 9 pairs of boots, warm clothing, coats, jackets, everything you'd need to survive in temperatures that were currently sitting at -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. Food was still there. Equipment was still there. The scene looked like the hikers had been preparing for bed. Some items were laid out as if they had been getting ready to sleep. But there were no people. Outside, the searchers found tracks, footprints leading away from the tent, down the slope toward the tree line about 1.5 miles away. 8 or 9 sets of prints. It was hard to tell exactly because the snow and wind had partially obscured them. Here's what made the searchers' blood run cold. Most of these footprints were from people wearing only socks, or a single boot, or were completely barefoot, in negative 30-degree weather, on a snow-covered mountain. But the prints showed no signs of panic. They weren't erratic. They weren't the prints of people running. The stride length suggested the hikers were walking at a normal pace, sometimes even in single file, as if they were calmly, deliberately leaving their tent and walking into the frozen night, walking to their deaths. The search party followed the footprints down the slope. About 1/2 mile from the tent, one of the searchers noticed something odd, a small piece of fabric clinging to a branch about 15 feet up in a cedar tree. They'd remember this detail later. At the tree line, near a large cedar tree, they made their first discovery. 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both were lying near the remains of a small fire. They'd attempted to build it beneath the cedar tree. The branches showed evidence of being burned, and there were ashes in the snow. But the fire had gone out. Or maybe they'd never gotten it going properly. Either way, it hadn't been enough. Both bodies were nearly naked. Krivonishenko was wearing only his underwear. Doroshenko was in underwear and a torn shirt. Their hands showed signs of desperate activity, broken branches, scratches, attempts to climb the tree. The cedar tree had broken branches up to about 15 feet high, and the searchers remembered that piece of fabric they'd seen. The 2 Yuris had climbed the tree. Why? To see something? To get away from something? To break off dry branches for the fire? Their feet were cut and bloodied from walking barefoot through the snow. But there were no signs of a struggle with another person, no defensive wounds, no evidence of combat. They had died of hypothermia, that much was clear. But why had they left the tent? Why had they walked 1.5 miles in their underwear? Why hadn't they returned to the tent once they realized they were freezing to death? The searchers spread out, following more tracks. 300 yards from the cedar tree, back toward the tent, they found another body. Igor Dyatlov, the expedition leader. He was lying on his back, facing toward the tent. His arms were positioned as if he'd been trying to crawl back up the slope. He'd made it about 1/4 of the way. He was wearing a little more clothing than the 2 Yuris. Underwear, 1 sock, a torn shirt, but nothing that could save him from the cold. He'd died trying to get back to the tent. Further along that same path, they found 2 more bodies. Rustem Slobodin, about 1,000 feet from Dyatlov, also facing toward the tent. He'd been trying to get back too. Like the others, he was inadequately dressed, but Rustem had something else, a small fracture to his skull. Not severe enough to kill him, but strange nonetheless. How had he gotten it? And then Zina Kolmogorova, even closer to the tent than Rustem. She'd made it the farthest in her attempt to return, only about 1/4 mile from the tent when she collapsed and died. She was on her knees, her face in the snow. Like the others, she wore minimal clothing. Her hands were frozen into fists. All 5 had died of hypothermia. But where were the other 4? The discovery of 5 bodies in a devastated tent sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union. This wasn't supposed to happen. These were experienced hikers. What could have driven them from their tent in the middle of the night? The investigation was led by Lev Ivanov, a prosecutor who specialized in complex cases. He arrived on site with a team of investigators, forensic experts, and more military personnel. They carefully documented everything, photographed the tent, the bodies, the surrounding area. They tried to piece together a timeline. The condition of the bodies suggested they had died on the night of February 1st, or the early morning of February 2nd. The fire had been built and had burned for a while before going out. The attempts to return to the tent had happened after the fire died. But nothing explained why they'd left in the first place. The autopsies on the first 5 bodies showed clear cause of death, hypothermia. The injuries were consistent with exposure and desperate attempts to survive. Cuts from walking on ice and rocks, frostbite, broken skin onto fingers from trying to build a fire with frozen hands. Rustam's skull fracture was noted, but the medical examiner determined it wasn't severe enough to be fatal or even incapacitating. It could have happened if he'd fallen during his attempt to return to the tent. The investigation seemed straightforward, if baffling. A tragic accident caused by something. Something that made 9 experienced hikers abandon their shelter and freeze to death. But they were still missing 4 bodies. The snow was deep. The search area was vast. February turned to March, and March dragged toward April. The searchers worked tirelessly, probing the snow, searching every crevice and ravine near the campsite. Then, on May 4th, nearly 2 months after finding the first bodies, a probe struck something solid in a ravine about 250 feet from the cedar tree, deeper into the woods. They started digging. What they found would transform this from a mysterious tragedy into something that defied explanation entirely. The ravine. The ravine was filled with over 10 feet of snow. As the search team dug down, they found water flowing beneath the snow, a small stream that had created a hollow space. And in that space, they found the remaining 4 hikers: Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Tybo-Brignol, and Alexander Zolotaryov, the oldest and most experienced member of the group. The first thing the searchers noticed was that these 4 were more fully dressed than the others. They were wearing multiple layers. Some of the clothing had clearly been taken from the first 2 bodies found by the cedar tree. Dubinina was wearing Krivonishenko's pants, and Zolotaryov was wearing Dubinina's jacket. This suggested a timeline. The 2 Yuris died first by the fire, and the others took their clothing to try to survive. But here's where everything gets disturbing. The second thing they noticed was the positioning. The 4 bodies were arranged in the ravine almost deliberately. Kolovatov had his arm around Dubinina. They appeared to have created some kind of makeshift den in the hollow beneath the snow. They had also tried to insulate themselves. Beneath the bodies, searchers found branches and pieces of clothing laid out like a floor. These 4 had been trying to survive. They'd found shelter. They'd layered up with extra clothing. They were doing everything right. So why were they dead? The bodies were taken for autopsy. And that's when the nightmare truly began. Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny performed the examinations. He was an experienced medical examiner, calm and methodical. But what he found shook even him. Lyudmila Dubinina had sustained massive chest trauma. Her ribs were broken. Fractures on both the right and left sides. The force required to cause this kind of injury was immense. Dr. Vozrojdeny noted in his report that it was comparable to the impact from a car crash. He wrote, "The force of the blow would have to be extremely strong, akin to the type of force experienced during a high-speed vehicle collision. But there was no external trauma, no bruising that matched the severity of the internal injuries. Her chest had essentially been crushed from the inside. And there was something else, something that would become one of the most discussed details of the entire case. Dubinina's tongue was missing, along with her eyes, part of her upper lip, and some facial tissue. The soft tissue of her face had been removed. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had similar injuries, massive skull fracture. The bone was cracked and depressed, the kind of injury you'd get from a severe blow to the head. Again, the force required was enormous. But, like Dubinina, there was minimal external damage, no corresponding bruising or laceration where the impact should have been. Alexander Zolotaryov, the war veteran who'd survived Stalingrad, had severe chest trauma similar to Dubinina's, multiple broken ribs. His chest cavity had been crushed with tremendous force, but no external wounds to explain it. Kolovatov's body showed less severe trauma, but his eyes were also missing, along with some soft tissue. Dr. Vozrojdeny was clear in his assessment. These were not injuries from a fight. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of hand-to-hand combat. The injuries were caused by extreme blunt force trauma, but not from a weapon like a club or a rifle butt. The force was more diffuse, covering larger areas of the body. He concluded that the injuries were consistent with an extreme force of nature. In his words, "These are the kinds of injuries I would expect to see in victims of a severe car crash or a blast wave. But there were no cars on the mountain, and there had been no explosion. So, what had happened in that ravine? Let's take a step back and consider what we know for certain. On the night of February 1st, 1959, 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their tent and fled into the deadly cold. They were not running from an avalanche. The tent was still standing. The slope showed no signs of an avalanche, and their footprints led away calmly. 5 of them died of hypothermia, trying either to build a fire or return to the tent. The other 4 made it to a ravine, took shelter, gathered extra clothing from the dead, tried to insulate themselves with branches, and then suffered catastrophic internal injuries. The injuries to the 4 in the ravine couldn't have been caused by a fall. The ravine wasn't deep enough, and the snow would have cushioned any impact. They couldn't have been caused by a person. No human could generate that kind of force, and there were no signs of an attacker. But something crushed their chests and skulls with the force of a car accident. And then there were the missing soft tissues. The official explanation for Dubinina's missing tongue and eyes was decomposition and scavenging by animals. The bodies had been in the ravine for 3 months. Running water was present. This kind of tissue loss is actually common in bodies submerged in water, where soft tissues decompose quickly and small animals can feed. But that didn't satisfy everyone. Some investigators noted that the missing tissues were too selective. Why the tongue specifically? Why not more random decomposition? And we haven't even gotten to one of the strangest details yet. Several pieces of clothing from the bodies were sent for radiological analysis. This wasn't standard procedure, but someone, it's not clear who, ordered the tests. The results showed that some of the clothing had elevated levels of radioactive contamination, not massively high, but significantly above background radiation. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater showed beta particle radiation levels that were elevated. Same with Kolovatov's clothing. And Krivonishenko had worked at a nuclear facility, so his exposure could potentially be explained by his workplace, though his clothes showed contamination as well. The radiation findings were real, documented in official reports. But what did they mean? By May 1959, all 9 bodies had been found and examined. Lead investigator Lev Ivanov had to make sense of it all and deliver a conclusion. The problem was, there wasn't a conclusion that made sense. Ivanov interviewed dozens of witnesses, local Mansi tribespeople who lived in the region, other hikers who'd been in the area, meteorologists. He examined every piece of evidence from the scene. In the end, on May 28, 1959, he closed the case with one of the most frustratingly vague conclusions in the history of criminal investigation. The cause of death was a compelling unknown force which the hikers were unable to overcome. That's it. A compelling unknown force. What force? He didn't say, couldn't say, because he didn't know. The case was classified. The area where the incident occurred was closed to hikers and skiers for 3 years. The families of the victims were told to stop asking questions. In the Soviet Union of 1959, you didn't push back against official decisions, and for decades, that's where the story ended. A compelling unknown force. The theories. For over 60 years, investigators, scientists, journalists, and amateur sleuths have tried to solve the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Dozens of theories have been proposed. Some are rational and evidence-based. Others venture into the realm of the bizarre and paranormal. Let's examine the most prominent theories, from the most plausible to the most outlandish. Theory 1, the most seemingly obvious explanation, an avalanche. The hikers heard or felt an avalanche starting, panicked, cut their way out of the tent, and fled down the mountain. In the chaos and darkness, they became separated and eventually succumbed to hypothermia. The injuries to the 4 in the ravine were caused by the avalanche itself or by falling while fleeing. This theory has been thoroughly investigated, including by recent studies. In 2020, a team of scientists used advanced modeling techniques to analyze whether an avalanche was possible on the slope where the tent was found. Here's what they discovered. A slab avalanche could have occurred. The slope angle was about 23 degrees, at the lower end of avalanche risk, but not impossible. The hikers had cut into the slope to create a level platform for their tent, which could have destabilized the snowpack. High winds that night could have deposited additional snow on the slope, adding weight. The modeling suggested that a delayed slab avalanche, occurring hours after the hikers went to sleep, could have partially buried the tent and injured some of the hikers. But here are the problems with the avalanche theory. First, the footprints. If there had been an avalanche, the footprints leading from the tent would have been buried or destroyed, but searchers found clear footprints leading down the slope in an orderly fashion. Second, the tent. It was still standing, mostly, and was not buried under massive amounts of snow. An avalanche severe enough to cause the internal injuries found on the bodies should have completely buried or destroyed the tent. Third, the behavior. If you're fleeing an avalanche, you run. You panic, you scatter. But the footprints showed a calm, orderly departure. Some prints were even in single file. Fourth, the injuries. The autopsy clearly stated that the chest and skull injuries happened while the victims were alive, based on hemorrhaging patterns. But if they'd been injured in the tent by an avalanche, could they really have made it almost 300 feet into the woods to a ravine, built a shelter, and gathered clothing? The avalanche theory explains some aspects of the incident, but it leaves too many questions unanswered. Theory 2. This theory is more technical and, in some ways, more terrifying. Infrasound is sound at frequencies below the normal range of human hearing, typically below 20 Hz. Humans can't consciously hear it, but we can feel it. And in certain conditions, infrasound can cause intense psychological and physical effects. Symptoms of infrasound exposure include anxiety, extreme uneasiness, disorientation, nausea, and most importantly, panic and an overwhelming sense of dread. In experiments, people exposed to infrasound report feeling an inexplicable need to escape, a sense that something terrible is about to happen. Could infrasound have affected the Dyatlov group? The theory goes like this. The strong winds that night, blowing over the mountain and through the rock formations, created infrasound frequencies. These frequencies entered the tent, causing the hikers to experience sudden, overwhelming panic. In their confused and terrified state, they cut their way out of the tent and fled, driven by an uncontrollable urge to escape. Once away from the source of the infrasound, the tent and the immediate area of the slope, the effects would have worn off. But by then, they were too far from shelter, inadequately dressed, and it was too late. This theory is compelling because it explains the seemingly irrational behavior. It explains why experienced hikers would make such a catastrophic decision. They weren't thinking clearly. They were in a state of panic, induced by frequencies they couldn't even hear. There's even some historical precedent. In 1998, researcher Vic Tandy discovered that infrasound from a fan in his laboratory was causing feelings of unease and even visual hallucinations. Mountain winds creating infrasound is a documented phenomenon, but the theory has weaknesses. It doesn't explain the severe injuries to the fore in the ravine. Infrasound doesn't crush your chest or fracture your skull. And while infrasound can cause panic, would it really cause 9 experienced hikers, several of whom were trained in emergency response, to all succumb to panic simultaneously? Theory 3. Hypothermia. Induced paradoxical undressing. Here's a well-documented phenomenon that might explain part of the mystery. Paradoxical undressing. In the final stages of severe hypothermia, victims sometimes remove their clothing. This seems counterintuitive. You're freezing to death. Why would you take off your clothes? But it happens in 20 to 50% of fatal hypothermia cases. The theory is that as hypothermia progresses, the cold causes blood vessels to constrict. Eventually, the muscles controlling these blood vessels become exhausted and fail. Blood suddenly rushes to the extremities, and the victim feels a sensation of extreme heat. They feel like they're burning up. In their confused, hypoxic state, they start removing clothing. Additionally, severe hypothermia causes confusion, poor decision-making, and behavior that seems irrational. Could this explain the Dyatlov incident? Perhaps something. A small avalanche, a collapsed tent, a sudden scare, caused the hikers to briefly leave the tent. Maybe they thought they'd just be gone for a minute to check on something. But in the extreme cold, hypothermia set in rapidly. As it progressed, their judgment deteriorated. They became confused, disoriented. Some started removing clothing, paradoxical undressing. They tried to build a fire, but were too impaired to do it effectively. Some tried to return to the tent, but collapsed on the way. The 4 in the ravine, in their hypothermic confusion, might have suffered falls or other trauma that caused their injuries. This theory has merit because it's based on known medical phenomena, but again, it struggles to explain the severity and nature of the injuries in the ravine. A confused hypothermic person might fall, but would they sustain injuries equivalent to a car crash? And would 4 of them sustain similar severe injuries? Theory 4. Military testing. Now, we enter more conspiratorial territory, but given the time and place, this theory can't be dismissed entirely. The Soviet Union in 1959 was engaged in intensive military testing, including missile tests, nuclear tests, and experimental weapons. The Ural Mountains region was home to multiple secret military installations. The theory suggests that the hikers witnessed or were affected by some kind of military activity. Perhaps they saw a missile test. Several witnesses in the region reported seeing orange spheres or bright lights in the sky around the time of the incident. If the hikers stumbled upon a military test, and if they photographed or documented it, remember they had cameras, the military might have had reason to silence them. Or perhaps they were exposed to something. Remember the radiation on the clothing? Krivonishenko had worked at a nuclear facility, but what about the others? Could they have been exposed to radioactive material from a weapons test? Or perhaps they were killed by a weapon test itself. Some theories propose thermobaric weapons, fuel-air explosives that create massive pressure waves. These weapons can cause severe internal injuries with minimal external trauma, exactly like what was found on the bodies. The compelling unknown force Ivanov mentioned in his official report, he later claimed in interviews given decades later that he believed the incident involved bright flying spheres, UFOs in modern parlance, though he might have meant military test craft. The military testing theory is supported by several factors. The area was relatively close to military installations. The case was classified, and the area was closed for years. The radiation findings, though low level, were unusual. The severe injuries without external trauma are consistent with blast wave injuries. Witness reports of unusual lights in the sky. But there are problems. No military installation admitted to testing in that specific area on that date. The injuries, while severe, don't perfectly match blast injuries. There was no damage to the eardrums, which would be expected from a blast wave. And if this was a military cover-up, why allow investigators to examine the scene at all? Why not simply declare the hikers lost and close the case immediately? Theory 5. Mansi Attack. Some early theories suggested that the local Mansi people attacked the hikers, perhaps for trespassing on sacred land. Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain, had spiritual significance to the Mansi, but this theory was quickly dismissed for several reasons. The Mansi were interviewed extensively and had no reason to attack the hikers. The Mansi had historically been peaceful and had good relationships with Soviet authorities. The injuries were not consistent with a human attack. No defensive wounds, no signs of combat, and no human could generate the force needed for the ravine injuries. The Mansi helped extensively with the search and rescue efforts. This theory persists in some circles, but has been largely abandoned by serious investigators. Theory 6. Animal attack. Could an animal have caused the incident? A bear or pack of wolves, perhaps. The area was home to large predators. A bear emerging from hibernation or a pack of hungry wolves might have attacked the tent. The hikers, in panic, fled. But this theory has fatal flaws. There were no animal tracks found around the tent. There were no bite marks or claw marks on the bodies. Bears hibernate in winter and wouldn't be out in February. The injuries, again, were not consistent with animal attacks. An animal attack would have left clear evidence. The missing soft tissues on Dubinina and Kolovatov could be explained by scavenging animals after death. But an animal attack doesn't explain the initial departure from the tent or the severe blunt force trauma. Theory 7. Fighting among the group. Could the hikers have turned on each other? A fight breaking out, leading to chaos and death? This was briefly considered but quickly dismissed. The injuries showed no signs of interpersonal violence, no defensive wounds, no evidence of a struggle between the hikers. and the pattern of death doesn't fit. Why would they all end up scattered across the landscape in different stages of hypothermia? Moreover, everyone who knew the group stated they were close friends with no interpersonal conflicts. Their diaries showed no signs of discord. Theory 8. Secret government testing or cover-up. A more elaborate conspiracy theory suggests the Soviet government was conducting secret experiments, perhaps chemical weapons testing, psychological warfare experiments, or other classified projects. According to this theory, the hikers were unwitting test subjects. They were exposed to some chemical agent or experimental technology that caused panic, confusion, and the injuries found. The government then covered it up. Supporting this theory, the rapid classification of the case, the closure of the area for 3 years, some contradictions in official reports, the vague, compelling unknown force conclusion. Against this theory, no evidence of chemical exposure in autopsies, aside from the low-level radiation. The government would have been more thorough in a cover-up. Why use experienced hikers as test subjects when you could use prisoners or volunteers? Theory 9. Yeti Menk. The local Mansi people have legends of the Menk, a large, aggressive creature similar to the Himalayan Yeti or North American Bigfoot. Some theories suggest a Menk attacked the tent, causing the hikers to flee in terror. The creature then pursued them, causing the injuries found in the ravine. This theory is based on local folklore about the Menk, the extreme force of the injuries, the inexplicable nature of the incident. But there's no physical evidence whatsoever for the existence of such a creature, and the footprints leaving the tent were clearly human. Theory 10. UFOs and extraterrestrial activity. The most outlandish theory attributes the incident to extraterrestrial involvement. Based on the witness reports of orange spheres in the sky, some theorists propose that the hikers encountered a UFO. Perhaps they were abducted and experimented on, then returned. Perhaps the UFO emitted radiation or some kind of energy weapon. Investigator Lev Ivanov himself, in later interviews, suggested he believed the incident involved bright flying spheres, and that he was pressured by Soviet authorities to omit this from his official report. But without evidence, this remains pure speculation, new evidence and modern investigations. For decades, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remained an unsolved mystery, occasionally making headlines but never getting closer to resolution. But in recent years, several new investigations have shed light on the case. In 2019, on the 60th anniversary of the incident, Russian authorities announced they would reopen the case. They examined 3 main theories: avalanche, hurricane-force winds, and a snow slab collapse. After months of investigation, they concluded that a snow slab avalanche was the most likely cause. They claimed that the hikers cut their way out of the tent to escape the avalanche, and the injuries were caused by the snow and ice. But this official conclusion was met with skepticism by many researchers and by the families of the victims. It didn't adequately explain all the evidence, particularly the nature of the injuries and the orderly retreat from the tent. In January 2020, a study published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment used advanced computer modeling to investigate the avalanche theory. The researchers, led by Alexander Puzrin from ETH Zurich and Johann Gaum from EPFL Switzerland, created detailed models of the snow conditions, the slope, and the tent setup. They concluded that a delayed slab avalanche, occurring several hours after the hikers went to sleep, was possible and could explain some aspects of the incident. They proposed that cutting into the slope to level the tent site, combined with high winds depositing additional snow overnight, created conditions for a localized slab avalanche. This small avalanche could have injured the hikers in the tent, causing them to flee. The study was rigorous and well received, but critics noted it still didn't explain everything, particularly the orderly nature of the departure and the severe injuries without corresponding external trauma. In 2021, the Russian Prosecutor General's office sent another expedition to the site with avalanche experts, forensic specialists, and even Hollywood animators who specialize in recreating disasters. They concluded that the hikers were hit by a slow-moving avalanche that didn't bury them, but injured them in the tent. This supposedly explained why they cut their way out and fled. Again, this conclusion failed to satisfy many observers. Until his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin, the hiker who turned back due to illness, thus saving his life, gave numerous interviews about the incident. Yudin always maintained that there was something unusual about the incident. He noted several odd details. When he left the group, everyone was in good spirits. There were no conflicts, no concerns. The decision to camp on the slope of Kholat Syakhl didn't make sense to him. The group knew better than to camp on an exposed slope in bad weather. He believed something scared them out of the tent, something unexpected and terrifying. In his later years, Yudin became increasingly convinced that the incident involved something beyond a natural disaster. He didn't claim to know what, but he felt certain that the official explanations were incomplete. One frustrating aspect of the case is that some evidence has gone missing over the decades. Several photographs taken by the hikers on their final day were supposedly never released. Some researchers claim there are images that show strange lights or objects in the sky that were removed from the official case files. One photograph, known as the last photograph, allegedly shows something unusual, though interpretations vary wildly. Some see a figure in the tree line, others see a bright light. Skeptics see nothing but blurred snow and overexposure. The truth is, many of the original case files have been lost, destroyed, or are still classified in Russian archives. In 2021, physicist Dr. Elena Buyanova proposed a unique theory involving ball lightning and electromagnetic phenomena. She suggested that the combination of wind, static electricity from the snow, and specific atmospheric conditions could have created ball lightning, a rare and poorly understood phenomenon. Ball lightning is known to cause strange effects. It can pass through solid objects, emit radiation, cause burns without external trauma, and induce extreme fear in witnesses. Dr. Bayanova proposed that ball lightning entered or formed near the tent, terrifying the hikers into fleeing. The electromagnetic effects could have caused some of the injuries, and the radiation found on clothing could be explained by electromagnetic discharge. This theory is intriguing because ball lightning is a real phenomenon, though rare and unpredictable. It's been documented in scientific literature, though not well understood. But, like all theories, it has gaps. Would ball lightning cause the specific pattern of injuries found? Would 9 experienced hikers all panic and flee from a natural phenomenon, even if unusual? Some modern researchers have focused on the psychological aspects of the incident. Group panic is a documented phenomenon. Under extreme stress, especially in isolated, dangerous conditions, groups can make catastrophic decisions collectively. Combine this with the effects of hypothermia, which impairs judgment rapidly, and you have a recipe for tragedy. Perhaps something relatively minor happened, a tent pole breaking, a startling noise, one person panicking, and in the extreme conditions, the situation spiraled out of control before anyone could think rationally. This doesn't explain the severe injuries, but it might explain the initial departure from the tent, the enduring mystery. So, what really happened on Dead Mountain on the night of February 1st, 1959? After 65 years, countless investigations, scientific studies, and endless theorizing, we still don't have a definitive answer. Here's what we know with certainty. 9 experienced hikers set up camp on a mountain slope in extreme winter conditions. Something caused them to cut their way out of their tent and flee into the deadly cold, wearing minimal clothing. They walked calmly down the slope toward the tree line. 2 died trying to build a fire near a cedar tree. 3 died trying to return to the tent. 4 sought shelter in a ravine, where they died from catastrophic internal injuries. The injuries cannot easily be explained by any single natural phenomenon. The behavior cannot easily be explained by standard panic or confusion. The radiation, the missing soft tissues, the witness reports of lights in the sky, none of it quite fits together into a coherent narrative. The most likely explanation is probably a combination of factors. Perhaps an avalanche or snow event damaged the tent, causing the hikers to flee. Perhaps infrasound or another environmental factor caused disorientation. Perhaps hypothermia impaired their judgment more rapidly than expected. Perhaps the 4 in the ravine suffered a secondary avalanche or a fall that caused their injuries. But even this combination doesn't quite satisfy. It feels like we're forcing puzzle pieces together that don't quite fit. The truth is, we may never know what happened. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are gone. The Soviet-era investigators are gone. Time and snow have buried the answers as surely as they buried the hikers themselves. What we're left with is a stark reminder of nature's power and mystery. The mountains don't care about our experience or our preparation. They don't care about our explanations or our need for closure. 9 young people, full of life and ambition, walked into the Ural Mountains and never walked out. Their story has become one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Books have been written, movies have been made, websites and forums endlessly debate the details. And on Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain, there stands a memorial to the Dyatlov group, 9 names carved in stone, a reminder of the 9 who died and the mystery they left behind. The Dyatlov Pass Incident resonates because it touches something primal in us, the fear of the unknown, the terror of being overwhelmed by forces beyond our control or understanding. We like to think we've conquered nature. We have technology, knowledge, preparation. We tell ourselves that if we're smart enough, careful enough, experienced enough, we'll be safe. The Dyatlov group were all those things. And it didn't matter. Something happened on that mountain. Something that drove experienced outdoors people to make fatal decisions. Something that left injuries that don't match any known cause. Something that has never happened again in quite the same way. A compelling unknown force, the investigator wrote. Maybe that's the most honest answer we'll ever get. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets are too dark for us to ever fully bring into the light. If you made it this far, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most baffling mysteries. The Dyatlov Pass Incident reminds us that for all our knowledge and technology, there are still things in this world we cannot explain. What do you think happened on Dead Mountain? Was it a natural disaster? A secret military test? Or something else entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this investigation, make sure to subscribe to Dreaded Documentary for more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a good mystery, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay curious and stay safe out there.